Welcome to SportsLit. I'm Neil Acharya.
And I am Nate Sager.
There are professional athletes that have lost it all and recovered, and there are others that have just simply lost their lives. But it's rare to find someone in that perilous crack that lies in between an uplifting tale and a tragic ending. And that's where Joe Murphy lives. And that is where journalist Rick Westhead found him in Kenora, Ontario. Joe Murphy, a Canadian, became the first college hockey player to be selected first overall in the NHL Draft back in 1986. If that feat seems lost over time with the influx of U.S. college talent into the NHL, remember, it's just happened once since. And that was, of course, Rick DiPietro. Murphy was an enigma, marching to the beat of his own drum, sometimes referring to himself in the third person in a league that is quite uniform and still is. And that career of his lasted 779 games, from 86-87 to 2000 and 2001. Over that time, he won a Stanley Cup with the Edmonton Oilers in 1990. So how did he end up destitute in Northern Ontario? Well, the roots may have been in a nasty hit he took on January 9th, 1991. And the trauma it caused his brain may have altered the course of his future for the worse. And that's the premise of Finding Murph, how Joe Murphy went from winning a championship to living homeless in the bush, by Rick Westhead, an investigative journalist and senior correspondent with TSN.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Rick Westhead is like a civil litigator making a final argument in this book, in making the case for National Hockey League players to press their employer on a better system of aftercare. And Joe Murphy is sort of like the plaintiff that he's come to know personally in the process. National Hockey League players are entitled to the full truth about the consequences playing an elite contact sport can have on a person's brain. Sure, they get so much fame and money in their 20s and 30s, and with the average NHL salary now nearing $3 million US per year before escrow and taxes. But like a great editor said, fame is a vapor and riches take wings. The other part of that easily Googled quote is that the only thing that endures is character. But that is all gone Pete Tong for Joe Murphy, since it seems highly probable, as you mentioned, an untreated brain injury led to him being incapable of managing his affairs. We don't have definitive proof on it, but Rick gives us a pretty good idea about it. Obviously good for Rick Westhead and Trevor Kidd from the NHL Alumni Association for trying to give Murphy some support. There is a bleakness in wondering what leverage players have to make the NHL change. I think their union has had a shorter end of the stick since the 2004-05 lockout. And generally, society right now seems to have no way to pull the emergency brake on the 1%'s commitment to money above all else. I mean, this is all happening when we're seeing sports going on in North America since teams and the media rights holders want the money. But at the end of the day, we know that a market can change a product. Joe Murphy's plight is it's like a through line for a book that really seems to be about a long history of science denialism that courses through our commercialized contact and combat sports. I would put Westhead's book on the shelf or on the app alongside John Branch's Boy on Ice, The Life and Death of Derek Boogaard, and Ken Dryden's Game Change, The Life and Death of Steve Monador.
Did it just get a little darker in here?
Yeah, Dark Path is my driveway, Neil. I would definitely say get all these three books. Just don't read them back to back to back, and don't read any of them while listening to Leonard Cohen with a Crown and Cola on the end table. December 2020 is going to feel long enough already. But Branch's Boy on Ice showed how much the opioid crisis is in our sports. Like Derek Boogaard is a prime example. He was a fighter, and he died of an overdose in 2011. I sort of want to use that to ask Westhead, I guess, about progress with players using cannabis for pain relief. The train is rolling on the use of it for like rest and recovery as a sleep aid, since players are saying we're using edibles in the NHL playoff hub, as ESPN reported. That's been a thing in junior hockey, one of those leagues where players have to sleep on the bus after away games. General managers and agents might prefer players using whatever gets them back in the lineup the quickest. Dryden's Game Change, of course, called on the NHL to ban all hits to the head. Adapt the game to sort of reflect the risk and what we know about the risk. Of course, that can get turned around to, oh, you want to turn hockey into tiddlywinks. You might as well call it sarcastaball on skates. Yeah, that's exactly what I want. While we're at it, those reverse retro jerseys, they should have some sequence. Yeah, no, it's about finding the optimal point where the game is fast and players use their skill to find order in the chaos, but it's still safe to play without lowering the intensity to the level of flag football, to borrow a phrase from our recent guest, Brian Burke. So Dryden had his headline grabber, but this firm line in that book is just curbing the frequency and force of blows to the head. I think that points up how one can sort of lose the room or the solid ground when they use the hardline verbs such as abolish or defund. Tricky analogy, but with that hits to the head debate in hockey and brain trauma, I think it's really sort of akin to what Gabrielle Giffords, the former United States Congresswoman who survived being shot in the head 10 years ago, was found while trying to get a voter buy-in in her home state of Arizona and elsewhere on reforming gun laws. Gun control is a literal trigger phrase to some people. A simple reframe to gun safety can actually be a winning issue. People are more receptive. They're saying, okay, I see where you're coming from. I guess that's her pro tip on de-escalation. All culture wars are one thing. One group says we should improve part of society somewhat through prescriptive measures, and one group doubles down with a rearguard action, and really they would probably both accept something similar.
Nate, do you have a Substack newsletter I can subscribe to?
It's coming soon. BFF, Personal Padlock, Pinky Promise. What I remember sort of about those 3 NHL deaths, Bugard died in the spring of 2011, and then Wade Belak and Rick Rippon each died by suicide that summer. Probably seemed like a smoking gun to people who wanted to get fighting out of hockey. They were all sort of recently active NHL players. They were all guys who were selfless about sticking up for their teammates. And by that point, the NHL was 2 years out from its first confirmed CTE case, Reg Fleming, a tough guy from the 60s and 70s who died in 2009. Fleming, facing a life of trouble due to the effects of earning a paycheck as he best knew how, had been captured 3.5 decades earlier in Earl McRae's classic magazine profile, Requiem for Reggie. So around the time of those deaths, as Westhead relates in the book, NHL executives in their correspondence between each others, they had accepted the link between, quote, repeated brain trauma and personal tragedies. But, the media didn't know about that. And while all that's going on, one corner of the media says, okay, time to push all your chips in and call for a fighting ban. But that created an opening for a counter-narrative of, nothing needs to change. You're overreacting. Ironically, some of those latter takes, I think, did point out that headshots were a far bigger issue for hockey than fights. And that is actually the greater truth. Even when laced with just a bit of disingenuity. I probably got caught up in that too, and in hindsight, the focus should have been on the head hits, mental health, and, athletes, self-medicating. Now, sort of segue toward the science denialism I mentioned. One would be forgiven, I think, for believing people have only gotten alert about sports brain issues within the last 15, 20, 25 years. Westhead shows in his narrative this didn't start in 2008 or 1998 or 1978. He actually pins it to 1928 when sports writer and NHL official Lou Marsh called for mandatory fiber helmets after seeing a Detroit player injured during a game in Toronto. That was so long ago that the Detroit team was still called the Cougars, not the Red Wings. That same year, a chief medical examiner in the U.S. named Dr. Harrison Martland published findings about punch-drunk boxers. So these concerns were raised. They were out there in medical journals. They probably made it into newspaper columns, such as Marsh's. But it's easy to imagine that, it never really got placed at the front door of hockey's gatekeepers, and thus they didn't have to act on it. Rick is kind of encouraging us to grasp that long tail with brain trauma and the NHL, among others, playing defense, creating some plausible deniability, and fans buying into that narrative. As for Joe Murphy, he could easily just be looked at as someone who had it all and blew it with bad choices. But no one becomes a millionaire playing a sport and then plans to end up out unhoused at the age of 50. I take all that and sort of frame it in the knowledge that a health crisis of any scale can't really be solved solely through personal responsibility and preventive actions by individuals. I think that general point is all around us every day right now, Neil. But thankfully, we do have this time and space for a creative outlet with our podcast. We've had cheerier intros, by the way. You trust us on that one, but definitely visit sportslit.ca to verify it.
Well, today it's a tale of two Ricks in some senses. We have Rick Westhead coming up and Rick Vive later on, which you will see on a separate published podcast. Remember, you can find them all on our website at sportslit.ca and wherever you get your podcasts. So coming up, Rick Westhead to talk about finding Murph. Welcome back to Sports Lit. Nate, of course, we're pleased to have Rick Westhead with us today to talk about finding Murph. Welcome in, Rick.
Hi.
So I'm going to ask you the first question, which is, what is the latest on the whereabouts of Joe Murphy as you know it?
I don't know. I understand from watching the news that he has moved on from west from Kenora, where I spent most of my time with Joe, and that he's, at least this past summer, was in Regina in Saskatchewan. I understand that he's there now, but I have not had contact with him for some months, so I couldn't say.
And just for our listeners that haven't read the book, so how did you first run into Joe Murphy and find out about his story?
Well, I found out about his story through doing my day-to-day job as a reporter with TSN and CTV. In 2013, a group of former National Hockey League players sued the league, alleging that the NHL has downplayed the risks and dangers of repeated brain trauma. And it was a compelling story. And so, at the time, I was just moving over to TSN from newspapers and picked up on this story. And I thought that the best way to tell it was through the lives of players and their families who actually had been affected by repeated brain trauma. And so that led me to profile players like Mike Peluso and Dan Lacouture. I got to know the family of Matt Johnson, another former NHL player. We'd talk with Bernie Nichols frequently about where he was at with his life and some of the symptoms that he was struggling through. And so Joe's story, I learned of it, found out that he was said to be living homeless in northern Ontario, in Kenora, near the border with Manitoba. And so set off with the TSN crew to see if we could find him. The arrangement that we reached with Trevor Kidd. Trevor is a former NHL goalie who lives in Winnipeg and spends some of his downtime in Kenora with his family. We agreed to go out together looking for Joe. And Trevor, of course, having played in the NHL, wanted to make this offer to Joe for whatever help that he might need. He was really disturbed to hear that an NHL player was living homeless. And the deal was that Trevor would talk to him, and if Joe was open to it, that we would approach him for an interview. And if he wasn't open to it and he wanted to maintain his privacy, we'd turn around and head back to Toronto, and we wouldn't film a frame of him. So obviously Joe agreed, and we did a documentary for TSN, and that led to a book offer. And I remember talking to Joe about why he thought this was important, and he said that he wanted his story to serve as a cautionary tale to other players, and that it also made him feel relevant for the first time in many years. So he wanted this project to go forward.
And the documentary came out in 2018, correct?
That's right, yeah, and then the book came out this fall.
Right, on October 13th, so about 5 weeks ago. Just in terms of Joe, I mean, you spent a lot of time around him. So, I mean, where do you see this ending? I mean, I know it's a haunting thought. It also could be encouraging. Maybe it'll end well. But where do you see this ending, given the amount of time you spent with him recently?
Who can say? I've got no idea. I'm no expert on this. I'm not a doctor, obviously, and I'm not an expert on homelessness. I do know from talking to Joe and from advocates who work in the mental health space and to people who work with the homeless, this is a really hard life. And, what it has done for me is highlight the fact that there are many Canadians who are struggling in similar circumstances. We're not doing books or podcasts about them because they didn't play in the National Hockey League and they weren't the number one overall pick.
Right.
But it's a very hard life from everything that I've been told. And I don't know how it's going to end for Joe. That turn to something more positive, to him accepting help, I hope that he gets to a point where he really, truly wants that. I know that he's battling with a lot of internal demons about whether to get off the streets or not. So, long answer, but I have no idea.
And Joe's plight is, obviously, it's really striking. But how much is Finding Murph also a book that explains sort of a long history of, the contact and combat sports, sort of playing defense and trying to create, plausible deniability about the risk of brain injuries and their lasting effects?
Well, you said it. This is the attitude of the National Hockey League and other professional leagues. They're a business, full stop. I remember watching Gary Bettman, the commissioner of the NHL, testify last year in Ottawa, and he talked about how the NHL, in his view, is a family, and the league tries to have services for players and their families who need them available. But hearing some stories about what the NHL has actually done and how it's managed players who have been brain injured and their families, both active players and retired players, doesn't sound very much like a family to me. I'm reminded of the story of Bridie Lacouture, Dan Lacouture's ex-wife. Dan Lacouture, I write about him in this book. He's a gritty New Englander who played for Boston Bruins and the New York Rangers. And when he was playing for the Rangers, he got in a fight with Robin Regier and fell backwards on the ice and smashed his head on the ice and was knocked unconscious. You can Google this fight and see it if you choose to. And when he regained consciousness and he's in the locker room after the game, and, does he go for an MRI or a CAT scan? No and no. Is he sent to see a neurologist? No. Is he sent to see a doctor? No. The team trainer basically gives his wife, this is according to her, some pain pills and tells her to keep waking Dan up throughout the course of the night. So you put yourselves in the shoes of Bridie Lacouture. If this was your partner, if this was something that's happening, not in the 1910s or 20s, but, 1990s and 2000s, is that really the best the NHL and its teams can do for a player and their family in a situation like that? And, where does that lead? Through repeated brain trauma, Dan Lacouture became a different person. His marriage broke down. He doesn't see his kids now because of this. His family is at a loss. So is the NHL a family? I think that there's evidence out there that suggests that it's not all players being brought out on the ice in convertibles and waving to the crowd and living their best life in retirement. There's other stories that need to be told, even as uncomfortable as they might be.
And true. And you sort of say, you mentioned the 1990s and 2000s when things were going on, and they're still going on now. For our readers, why is the year 2000 the point you identify when the NHL really should have started paying attention to long-term neurological damage and started funding brain injury research?
Well, the year 2000 is interesting because it was when a group of neurologists came out with research that definitively linked brain trauma and long-term neurological problems. But again, I point out that year. It's hardly the only milestone or signpost that the NHL and its medical team could have looked for. The league, again, has pushed this narrative that brain injuries are something that no one used to focus on. That's just not true. You did not have to read medical journals or follow the Lancet magazine medical journal to know this. If you watch CBC and CTV, if you read the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star, all of these collective studies showing that the risks of long-term problems like dementia and Parkinson's and other brain diseases were higher with repeated brain trauma. Heck, back in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the NCAA came out with a guidebook for teams that played contact sports for universities, which was written by the head of surgery at Harvard University. And this was a warning to teams not to allow players back in the game until after their symptoms from concussions were gone. So you guys tell me, how is it that that warning can come out in the 1930s, back when NHL players still were not wearing helmets? And 30, 40 years after that, 50 years after that, it wasn't uncommon to see an NHL player woken up from unconsciousness with smelling salts and slapped on the butt and put back in the game. Where's the logic? How does that make any sense?
It really doesn't.
in terms of that research and finding all that documentation, I know you've been at this for a long time, but I mean, what first drew you to that? And I mean, how exhaustive was the research? Because there's a lot of information in this book, such as what you just mentioned.
What drew me to it? Maybe the fact that very few others seem to be doing it. You know, the New York Times reporters like John Branch, Ken Belson have done a great job documenting the issue of brain injuries in contact sports. They particularly focused on the NFL, of course, because the NFL in the United States is the biggest of all the pro sports. But where's the coverage been in Canada? You know, we have an abundance of people who go to games, you know, hockey media who cover teams, ask guys how they're feeling. Will you look forward to the next game? Will you look back and tell us about your goals? But where's the journalism? And I guess that's one of the reasons that I was driven to do this, because I thought there was a need for it. That, you know, we have a lot of people, like I said, who are media, who might profess to be journalists, but really when it comes to holding the powerful NHL accountable and an opportunity to speak truth to power, I didn't see a lot out there. And I thought this was important to add to the discussion.
Journalism is in a very interesting place too, and I mean, there's media silos. For example, you know, the league, for example, has a lot of former journalists that write for them now, so they probably would never touch this story. Sportsnet has the rights to the NHL, so I mean, in a way, are you almost in a perfect spot to actually be free to be a journalist, because you know you're with TSN. That doesn't have the rights, so you're kind of free to do this. Do you think that these media silos are part of the problem, perhaps?
Well, I'm not sure that I accept your argument. You know, Sportsnet has Canadian rights to the NHL. Who says that should stop a reporter at Sportsnet from looking into this? If you're a journalist, you're a journalist. TSN has ownership. TSN's parent company has ownership stakes in two of the largest teams in the NHL. TSN has local broadcast contracts with Canadian NHL teams. So the argument that TSN can do this where Sportsnet can't because of its business ties, I don't accept that. This is it's a subject that's important, that players and their families, like I said earlier, deserve to have covered objectively. And, you know, as long as you're right and balanced and fair, which I've made an attempt to be, I would think that every network would allow reporters to go and do reporting like this.
And by the way, I didn't want to say that was my argument. I'm just throwing that out there as a possible reason as to why, you know, you're saying that there isn't a lot of coverage out there. Perhaps that may be why. I appreciate your answer on that.
And it might be personal preference, right? It's at the end of the day, some people like going to the rink, and that's why they get into this, because they want to go to the rink and they want to be around pro athletes. And if they can find people, I guess, to pay them to do that, more power to them.
Right. Let's get into a little bit more about Joe and how great he was, or how good he was, especially coming out of, going into to university in the States. So I'd love for you to set that up when he ends up going to the Michigan State Spartans by reading page 41, if you will.
The Michigan State Spartans had never before sent a private plane to pick up a potential recruit. Joe Murphy was the first. Well, a charter flight to fly Murphy to East Lansing, Michigan in early December 1984 cost thousands of dollars. It was money well spent, Spartans assistant coach Terry Christensen believed. Christensen had been on the Spartans coaching staff since 1980 and had spent his fair share of time on the road in Western Canada during the 1984-85 season, following Murphy and the Knights. He was convinced Murphy had the ability to be a generational player, and he understood that the competition to land the young star was fierce. Besides offers from other U.S. college teams and the New Westminster and the Western Hockey League, Murphy had also received an invitation from Dave King to join the Canadian Olympic hockey program in Calgary. This guy could have played anywhere, Christensen said with an easy laugh from his own home in Rochester Hills, Michigan. We wanted to impress Joe and stand out from the competition. I don't think I've ever been so obsessed before about a player.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it's interesting. He's a maverick from the start in a way, Joe, right? I mean, he's a Canadian guy. He goes to U.S. college. He's the first overall pick. And, I mean, you illustrate, too, his nose for the net. He's fearless. I mean, yeah, I mean, what did you learn about him in terms of his skill level as a player and the way he thought the game as you started writing this book?
Just that, about how fast he was, how gifted he was, a great shot, a guy who would go into the corners and into the net, in front of the net. But, you know, I don't really see this, to be honest, guys, as a hockey book. I see this as journalism.
Right.
And so maybe there's not as much attention paid to what somebody could do on the ice as there would be in a typical hockey memoir, for instance.
Right.
Obviously, this is an effort to try to memorialize and document some of the bigger games in Joe's NHL career, like when he was a member of the Edmonton Oilers when they won the Stanley Cup in 1990. But to me, the most fascinating parts of his personality and his character are revealed through him off the ice. You know, one of the stories I love from this book is one that Harry York told me. And Harry was a guy who made it to the NHL, played with St. Louis. And he was pretty crafty and canny himself. This was a guy who would always carry a pack of Marlboro Reds with him because he knew that's what the veteran players like to smoke, and would always offer to drive them from their homes to the airport. This is back in the time when NHL teams still traveled commercially. And so Harry tells a story that he had an apartment in the same complex as Joe Murphy. And on one weekend, Harry had his mother visiting and his aunt visiting from Canada.
Yeah.
So imagine it's midnight, and these two ladies are settled down on a couch watching Johnny Carson, and their hair is up in curlers, and they've got cold cream on their faces, and they're wearing glasses and big house coats and slippers. And all of a sudden, the door pops open, and Joe Murphy busts in and goes right to the kitchen, starts rooting through the fridge and the cupboards looking for some food, finds what he wants, comes back in the room, has never seen these ladies before in his life, and sits down on the couch in between them and says, "Hey, ladies, what are your names? I'm Joe Murphy." It strikes me as something like almost out of Seinfeld, where Kramer would come bursting through the door of an apartment. But Joe, you know, was outgoing and had a great personality. And he definitely did not fit into the monoculture of the NHL. He was always somebody who was an eccentric, just different. Someone who, for instance, would carry the book The Celestine Prophecies with him during a season and read that, as opposed to a hockey biography.
Indeed. And speaking of the off the ice stuff you mentioned, Rick, viewing what when you were writing about Joe early in his career when he was in the Detroit organization, I couldn't help but contrast it with how much teams, interact with a potential draft pick. In hindsight, was he sort of like put into a really, unfair situation when he was in Detroit, like because the hockey world hadn't really learned to accept that kind of personality?
Well, that's the way Neil Smith puts it. Neil, of course, went on to be GM of the New York Rangers, and he worked with the Red Wings when Joe was drafted. And he thinks Joe got a raw deal. Here's a kid, 18, first year in the NHL. He's put in with the Billet family, and on one of the very first road trips, goes to the airport to catch up with his team and take a flight. But only then he discovers that there's two airports in Detroit. You'd think, well, this guy played Michigan State. He must have known that. But where he was playing in Lansing, that's not Detroit. So he's 18 years old and he goes to the wrong airport and he misses the flight. Jacques Demers is a new coach with the organization and he wants to establish that he is the alpha male, and all of a sudden Joe is on the outs in the minors and, finding it very hard to earn his way back into the good books of Jacques Demers.
And I think it seemed now, and I seem to remember too, you bring up the fact that like on Joe's 19th birthday, there was like a scathing column written about him in the Windsor Star, which covered the Red Wings in those days. Like, what kind of effect do you think that would have had on his, young mind?
Good question. What do you guys think? I mean, how would you feel if you were 19 years old and somebody in your city where you lived was writing a column about you saying that you were a waste of a draft pick and washed up and a has-been who wasn't going to be able to meet the expectations of you?
I would feel pretty terrible. And I contrasted that with the most recent first overall pick to come in the NHL was Jack Hughes, and he scored 7 goals in 61 games, and he was, I think, last on the team in plus-minus, even though he only played about 3/4 of the games. But everyone's just like, he's 18. He's a boy playing in a men's league, and to see that compare and contrast to Joe not being given a chance, really stuck with me when you related that.
Yeah, good comparison.
The Detroit too. I mean, there were some internal troubles too with some of the players. So Joe in a way kind of came into an environment where he wasn't very insulated. I'm not sure how many environments were insulated back then in the NHL, but certainly Detroit didn't seem to be the ideal place.
Well, you had all kinds of off-ice issues with players there between Bob Probert and Klima, and there was no shortage of drama. Whether it was players being arrested for DUIs, getting in trouble for breaking team rules. I mean, this was a bit of a vagabond team, wasn't it?
Yeah, it seemed that way. I'm just wondering, I mean, and this is just me thinking aloud, I'm wondering how much different it was with most of the 21 teams at that time. I'm pretty sure there probably a lot of that going on with some of the other teams as well. It might have been a sign of the times. So in terms of Joe and the contributing factors as to why he kind of may have slipped into this position that he is in now, CTE, drug use, I was thinking about his era and money. And, he came into the league an eccentric talent, and he was making just over $200,000 to start the 90s, and then the lockout happens and the salaries go up, and he makes about $2.8 million a couple of years after the lockout, which I think that could be a contributing factor as well, right? He may have had access to more, I guess, party favors per se. Is that a plausible argument as well, Rick?
I don't know. If you're by party favors, do you mean does he have more access to drugs and booze and women? I mean, haven't NHL players always had that?
Sure. Well, a lot more money, I mean, at that time, too, in the league, right? I mean, to go from a couple of $100,000 to go to $2.8 million, that's a big difference in what you can buy.
Yeah, maybe it is. I do know that Joe's, like we've talked about, is not nearly the only problem player that's wound up with problems.
Right.
I write in the book about a former NHL Rookie of the Year who wound up in jail in British Columbia for a couple of days because he couldn't pay a bill in a cafe for like $2.
Mm-hmm.
Or Derek Sanderson. I interviewed Derek Sanderson for this book.
Right.
Who was on top of the hockey world in the 1970s, mm-hmm. and then, was sleeping on a park bench in New York and getting advice from other homeless people about how to position newspapers on the bench so that he would stay dry as possible through the course of the night.
Yeah. By the way, an excellent book, his biography by Kevin Shea. If you haven't read it, of course, our podcast focuses on sports books, so check that book out. It's really good. Yeah, and there's that famous line, right? He said, do you know who I am? And the guy's like, yeah, you're a bum just like me, right? Because that's how far he'd fallen. So go ahead, Nate.
And I'm sort of wondering, you bring up Neil Smith, and I think you note in the book that he's doing his own independent brain injury research. Obviously, you can't speak for Neil Smith, but is it those sorts of problems that have sort of led him to want to find out the truth for himself?
I think so, and I think that maybe Neil has a mistrust of the system. The NHL has had so many opportunities to get this right. Beyond selling itself as a family, it's in good times. This is a $5 billion business with teams who have relationships with some of the best medical minds in the world. So why do they seem to get it wrong so many times? Why is it when Ken Dryden says of the NHL that they should have a ban on head hits? This educated Hall of Fame goalie who has done all kinds of things with his life that are interesting. And when he becomes an advocate for that, the deputy commissioner of the NHL, Bill Daly, is asked about him in the course of a lawsuit. And Bill Daly says of Ken Dryden, well, he's got some good ideas, but he's really prone to grandstanding. Why would you treat a Hall of Fame goalie with an idea like that with scorn? In 2017, Eric Lindros and David Mulder, the chief surgeon for the Montreal Canadiens, went down to the All-Star game in Los Angeles and sat with the NHL's concussion committee and asked them to commit to investing $1 million per team into brain injury research. It's been 3 years and they still don't have an answer from that group. Why would the NHL, isn't that a layup? $1 million per team? We're talking about a third or fourth line player's salary.
Yeah, true.
The concussion spotter program that the NHL celebrates and is so celebrated by among the media for moving things forward. People say routinely, well, the NHL is doing so much better than it used to do, right? And they point to the concussion spotter program. You guys follow hockey. Who are the concussion spotters in the cities where you live?
Yeah, team employees, right?
Well,
who are they? We have no idea. How can you have trust? How can the public have any trust in a system that has zero transparency? If you pick up an NHL media guide, you can find anybody who's working for an NHL club. Everyone advertises that fact. Massage therapists, chiropractors, team doctors, trainers, strength coaches, scouts, amateur and professional. There's no secrets. So why is it, and I'm asking you this, why is it that the NHL would not want to say a single name of any of the concussion spotters whose job it is to make a call on whether a player should be taken off the ice to be examined by a doctor?
It's a very good question. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Now, that sort of does, lead into something we did want to ask. What are concrete steps that should be taken to better meet, I guess, legal and moral obligations to former players to make sure that no one, to reduce as much as possible the possibility that someone falls through the cracks?
Well, we've just covered three things that the NHL could do. One, treat Ken Dryden with a bit more respect and take that suggestion more seriously. Start identifying and having a transparent program for concussion spotting. Invest money in brain injury research so that you understand the health of your players. As things are now, there's more than 3,000 alumni, guys who played in the NHL. How many of those players are suffering from mental health challenges? And the answer is no one can say. And why is that? Because the NHL has never spent a dollar trying to answer that question.
Yeah, and the ballpark percentage would probably be, very high. And I sort of wanted to ask, this might seem maybe it seems a bit left field, but at one point you relayed a quote from Wayne Gretzky, I think around the time of the 1994 lockout, that NHL players came from middle-class families. They understood what it meant to be in a union, and now they have an average salary of about $3 million US before escrow. But I sometimes wonder how much the struggles, and I'm not trying to put the blame on the wrong people, but how much the struggle of retired players and maybe the treatment for the league perhaps tied to sort of a decline of the power of labor in North America.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, if you talk to the average NHL player, I'm sure you guys have interviewed some guys in the NHL. I have. What they're concerned about is their life right now. How can they maximize their earnings and stay in the NHL for as long as they can? If you ask the average 24, 25-year-old NHL player, what are you concerned about when you're in your mid-40s and your 50s when it comes to the kind of care that you have? They're going to give you a blank stare. They don't think about this. And this is part of the problem, because the NHL Players Association, the union that purports to be worried about things like this, is, fixed with trying to meet the needs and demands of its members. So it's worried about trying to maximize profits for players, and it does not spend as much time, if any, on the health and safety of retired players. That's left to the NHL Alumni Association, an association which is funded by the NHL. So, you are back in a situation where players don't have that independent oversight body challenging the NHL to do better. This is a subject that makes the league uncomfortable. It doesn't want to, have to justify what it does or the care that it gives to former players. But at the end of the day, is there anyone out there, anyone, who could say, I have absolute confidence that the NHL is doing everything it can for these guys and shouldn't be challenged and shouldn't be asked to defend its actions and do better for them?
Yeah, and any sport that purports to be, a public good obviously should be doing that. Something else that also interested me from your reporting with TSN and reporting that comes into the book. Now, former football player Nate Jackson, he wrote a really good book called Slow Getting Up. He wrote a few years ago that, as an ex-player, he's 10 years removed from playing. He uses sort of cannabis because it reframes pain. And I think you covered this in the book, and I have to ask, why would, one doctor that you spoke to who treats active pro players surgical aftercare be wary of prescribing legal cannabinoid pain relievers instead of opioids?
Well, because the teams and the league are worried about the reputational damage, I believe. Cannabinoids, they're natural. I'm not an expert on this. I'm basing this on my reporting and interviewing players and doctors. And maybe they won't work for everyone. I'm talking about marijuana and CBD. However, isn't it worth a shot? I mean, if you are playing in the NHL for a period of time, chances are that you're trying to find ways to get to sleep after, games where your adrenaline is pumping throughout the course of a game. So you're on this incredible high just playing the game with all this, coursing through you. And then you're trying to get to sleep 2 hours later, 3 hours later. And you're battling jet lag every couple of days because you're moving around between cities through the course of a season. And you're trying to navigate the pain of, life as an athlete when you're trying to stay in the lineup. So if your options are Ambien and, Percocets or opioids or other, even over-the-counter painkillers, isn't it worth looking to see if, cannabis would work for you as a potentially healthier alternative?
Yeah, and indeed, I think ESPN did report in September some players in the bubble in Edmonton said they used edibles for exactly what you said to get to sleep, Neil.
Yeah, Rick, I just want to ask you about your career background as well, because journalism has come up a lot in this, and that's one of the elements of this show. We like to talk to the author and get as much info as we can on them for people that don't know everything about you. Some people that listen to this program, may only know you from TSN, but you obviously have an extensive journalism background. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I started out as a sports writer, going to games and talking about, reporting on subjects like why the Canadian Football League doesn't have more Canadian quarterbacks. I wrote for the New York Times and the Globe and Mail and wound up full-time at the Toronto Star and got bored of sports, got bored of asking the kind of questions that we talked about.
Right.
How you feeling? Doing athlete profiles. And so I was hired as a foreign correspondent and moved to India. And I covered the war in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I've covered poverty issues throughout Africa. Been on the ground reporting in countries like Saudi Arabia and China, and joined TSN in 2014. So I'm very fortunate to have had the breadth of experience that I've had. And, I'm in a position now where I've got a network that supports me doing stories that matter, and journalism that can call attention and give a voice to people who don't have one, and to hold powerful people accountable, whether it's a pro sports league or whether it's a government, whoever it might be.
Would you like to see, I mean, we talked about this at the beginning of our interview, how you're not seeing this type of reporting happening. Would you like to see more of it, more people doing what you're doing in Canada with hockey?
Well, let me put it back to you guys. Would you?
Well, I absolutely believe that, more true journalism would be beneficial, 100%. Anyway, moving on.
I guess we're only getting one answer there.
Sorry, yes.
I'd like to see more of it.
I agree with everything Neil says.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Rick.
I'd like to see more of it. At the end of the day, I'd like to hope that people would be interested in doing original content, doing stories that really matter and contribute to the conversation about public good. About people sometimes will ask, "Oh, do you hate hockey?" on social media, and I don't even waste my time responding. Do I hate hockey? No, I hate a system where we don't have the opportunity to tell honest stories, where if you're a family like Brady Lacouture's, you've got no one to go to if you want to share your story publicly and help inform others who might not repeat the mistakes that you've made. So that's my answer.
Well, the book starts off with the quote from Bob Simon from CBS News. If you want to be loved, journalism is a poor career choice. I mean, when you started this book, was that the first thing that came to your mind? Because you knew how people kind of consume hockey in Canada?
Yeah, it's definitely something that I've thought about. And, it's no secret what people like to read, what people like to give at Christmas or other gifts. They like to give memoirs, of former hockey general managers talking about trades that almost happened or didn't happen or whatever. They like to read about players looking back on the good old days when the boys were the boys. So it was a question that I really did ask myself time and again. How open are people really going to be to having their impressions of this national sport of Canada challenged? How open are people going to be to looking at hockey in a different way?
Do you have another project in the works that will be in a similar vein, challenging the NHL?
Well, I've always got reporting that's ongoing. Whether it'll turn out to be a book or not, I can't say. But yeah, I mean, even since the book's been published, TSN broadcast a half-hour-long documentary called "The Problem of Pain," and that TV story documented the experience of active NHL players who say that repeatedly team trainers are giving out a drug called Toradol, an anti-inflammatory prescription drug, which is very powerful and a fantastic painkiller. The problem is that Toradol, if used extensively, the warning on its label says that you should not take this drug more than 5 days in a row. It can affect your organs. And so Ryan Kessler unveiled in this story that he has suffered from Crohn's disease and colitis, and has, days where he goes to the bathroom 20 or 30 times a day, passing blood each time. Kyle Quincy, another former NHL player, talks about his worries of taking so much Toradol, and so does Zenon Konopka. And in the case of every one of those players, the one common thread between their stories is they say that the trainers for their NHL teams never told them about what the potential side effects and dangers of using so much Toradol could be. So, do I have more work in me this way? Absolutely. I'm just not sure whether it's going to come out as a podcast or as another television story or as a book.
Has your job gotten harder as you've pressed more? I mean, in terms of, I know access is something that, you know, as an investigative journalist, you're digging. I mean, you're not looking for the PR guy to send somebody out. But I'm just wondering, I mean, I'm sure the league is probably aware of what you're writing, and I want to know if you found that your job has gotten harder.
That's a great question. I think it has and it hasn't. On one hand, it's definitely harder to do stories through the NHL's communications office, especially when you're quoting, you know, NHL internal emails and quoting the very people in your book that you're asking for help with other stories. Just to be clear, like with every story that I do on the NHL now, I email asking if they want to comment on it. That will never change. My responsibility is to give the NHL a chance to comment on all of these stories, whether they take it or not. But it's also, in a way, gotten easier because who else is doing the work? Who else is holding the NHL accountable like this when it comes to stories on brain injuries? There's a few people who are doing it. You know, Katie Strang at The Athletic does it. From time to time, you'll have reporters jump into this space. But it's not, I guess my point is, I'm not the only one, but it's definitely not a crowded space.
Right. And in terms of, I mean, again, we talked about, you know, every, you know, well, not in this detail, but yeah, every fall, you know, the memoir comes out, you know, the Rick Vive book or the Wendell Clark book. Obviously, this isn't that type of book. This is, as you say, true journalism. I wanted to know, part of kind of getting the word out is having to do media tours or whatever. Has that been, I mean, have you had a lot of people wanting to jump on and talk about this story and then finding that this isn't the Joe Murphy story, that, you know, they're not going to get the answers they want out of you, you know, because you're trying to tell a bigger story?
It's definitely the case where I'll do the story about Joe, or I'll do the interview and the questions will be about Joe, and I want to talk about more than that.
Right.
Joe's story is important, make no mistake, but the reason to do to spend the last couple of years on this was because I wanted to tell a larger narrative about, you know, how he is far from an isolated case. The media has been great, though. You know, I had a chance to do an interview with Matt Galloway on CBC the other day, and Dave Feschuk wrote a full-page story about the book in the Toronto Star, the largest circulation paper in Canada. So I can't complain. You know, it certainly does not have the people chattering in the hockey world like, you know, Brian Burke might have for his memoir.
Right.
I don't know. What do you think? What did you guys think of it? And do you think it will be too uncomfortable for many people who follow hockey?
I mean, I don't know. I think it really depends on the person. I think for sure it's not going to be the book you get for Christmas and you just tear through, you know, after dinner. I think you really got to take your time with this, and there's a lot of studies and research to process. And in that, I think it's a welcome sight in the sense that it isn't your typical memoir, for sure.
And I would just say...
It's definitely not Brian Burke recounting his fights with Steve Simmons. It's not sensational like that. It is, I believe, it's journalism. And, you know, it's interviewing people, everybody from Joe Murphy's former billet family in Penticton, British Columbia, to players and coaches and GMs, to medical experts, you know, through the years. You know, a former team doctor who says that he was fired by his NHL team because he was worried that players were being put back on the ice too soon after injuries. So I'm proud of the book, and I hope people will give it a chance and mark it up and, you know, hopefully come forward and find ways to get questions to me about it if they either want to challenge me on it or if they want to, you know, further the conversation about what the NHL can do more, like you guys are doing right now.
Well, we only have a couple of more questions for you, and we thank you for giving us this much time. And I wanted to ask you, right at the end of the book, you thank a few people, Sean Fitzgerald being one of them, and Dan Robson. And I one of the things I wanted to ask you, and you can fill in the blanks for me, is this your first book? And if so, was Dan helpful? And maybe because Dan is obviously very well versed in steering a narrative, and I think with true journalism sometimes to steer in a narrative, was he helping you with that? Was that your connection with Dan?
Well, not so much with the narrative, no.
Okay.
I talked to Dan a little bit about how contracts with publishers work, so that's what I was leaning on him for.
Okay.
And the same with Sean, because this is my first book, and I don't understand the book publishing world, and wanted to do this without the use of an agent. So so that's how it worked out. And for the record, because I know there have been a few people along the way who've asked me the question, well, what about the money from this book? What are you keeping, and what about Joe Murphy? Are you exploiting him? And just so people hear this from me directly, like I said, I've talked about this. After my writing expenses, hiring an editor, traveling to Kenora, traveling to Penticton, British Columbia, to St. Louis, to Chicago, what was left, I contributed to the Canadian Mental Health Association, to CAMH in Toronto here, to the United Way, and to the Daily Food Bank in Toronto.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely paying it forward. And just to quickly add, you were asking me how I take this book as a hockey fan. I sort of look at it, the motto from the TV show, Friday Night Lights, clear eyes, full hearts. If you identify with the people who play the game, you need to have your eyes open about what playing that game can do to them. And that sort of sets me up for a question that's, you're talking about, sort of taking on the national institution of hockey and, speaking for people who haven't had a voice. You were in the summer, like when all sports were shut down during the pandemic, I think you reported on the Dan Carcillo-led class action suit against the Canadian Hockey League about alleged abuse that he and other players were, suffered when they were teenagers. Now, that might not see a courtroom for some time, but it's the second major class action suit the CHL has faced, and I'm just wondering, like, how much are those things pointing up that maybe that whole concept of major junior hockey, which is really age-capped minor pro hockey, it might need a reboot to be modernized and safer for young people to play.
Yeah, boy, the Canadian Hockey League is in a tough spot right now, beyond the pandemic and not being able to play games regularly. By my count, they're facing 4 lawsuits that have real consequence. There was a lawsuit against the CHL over minimum wage and whether players should be allowed to play without paying them. And that case was actually settled until the judge rejected the settlement, something that almost never happens. So that settlement being turned over means that case may move forward again now through the court system. Then the CHL is also facing a concussion class action. They're also facing a lawsuit, like you mentioned, filed by Dan Carcillo and others over hazing and abuse. And they're also facing a challenge in Canadian federal court over anti-competitive behavior. So it, definitely, if you're following the CHL and these stories closely, you're going to feel like you've earned a law degree when this is all done.
Yeah, and I, used to cover junior hockey, and I was one of those people who loved going to the rink, but now it just, a couple of years ago, just an accumulation of things, I just sort of had to say I'm done here. I just keep imagining, and you can tell me if I'm, out of my mind here. Like, I just keep imagining it. Maybe it's time to take some, figure out what can be salvaged about it, and just reboot it as maybe a league for slightly older players, and pay salaries, put more emphasis on personal development, not play 68 games, maybe play like 50 or something. Am I way off there?
I'm probably not the one best to answer that question. I haven't looked into this, but I do know if I had a 16-year-old who was good enough to play in that league, I'd have concerns about the amount of travel that they do in the course of a season, about trades in the middle of the season, about how focused he was on schoolwork. And there are kids who are able to juggle everything and, graduate as Ontario scholars, and that's great. But we all know how fleeting this life as a pro athlete can be if they make it to the NHL, right? How many junior hockey players don't make it there? So I I definitely think there's going to be more conversations about reform and about what needs to change to make this better. In terms of the specifics, let's leave that one for another day.
Well,
thanks.
Thank you for joining us on this day, Mr. Westhead, and it was good to have you.
I appreciate it, guys. I know, like I said, it's probably not the traditional hockey book, and I thank you for the smart questions, and obviously you guys have read the book, and I appreciate that as well. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks again.